The voicemail from my daughter Monica didn't start with a greeting. It started with the sound of her car's turn signal. It was a rhythmic, impatient click that cut through the low hum of her dashboard. "Mom, I'm dropping Maeve off at 6:30 instead of 7:30 tomorrow. Mitchell has an early call with the London office, and I can't be late for this gallery walkthrough. Also, did you get those low-sodium crackers Toby likes? Calvin says he's dropping him off around 8. Make sure Toby doesn't drink apple juice before noon. It messes with his stomach. Thanks. Love you." The click of the hang-up was immediate. There was no pause to wait for an answer, no question of whether my Tuesday morning was already occupied, and no acknowledgement that 68-year-old knees do not move as quickly at 6 in the morning as they used to. I sat in the driver's seat of my 10-year-old sedan, parked in the farthest corner of the grocery store lot. It was 9:45 p.m. The fluorescent lights from the supermarket facade cast a long, sterile green glow across the wet asphalt. A light drizzle was beginning to fall, highlighting the grease stains on my windshield. In my lap sat 3 different grocery lists written on 3 different scraps of paper. One was mine, consisting mostly of tea, milk, and a small package of chicken thighs that would last me 3 days. The second was Monica's, organic berries, imported sheep's milk cheese, and a specific brand of sparkling water she insisted kept her hydrated during her long curatorial shifts. The third was Calvin's, written in his hasty, sprawling handwriting on the back of an unpaid water bill. Frozen waffles, juice boxes, and a tube of generic ointment for Toby's eczema. I had paid for all of them. I always did. When you spend 40 years managing a household, your family stops seeing you as an individual with a bank account or a personal schedule. You become a utility, like the electricity running through the walls or the water flowing from the tap. No one thanks the pipes for delivering water. They only complain when the pressure drops or when the faucet begins to leak. Inside the grocery store, my knuckles had throbbed from the damp autumn air. As I stood in the cereal aisle, trying to find the exact brand of dye-free flakes Calvin's ex-wife insisted Toby eat, a younger woman had brushed past me with her shopping cart. She hadn't looked at me. She didn't apologize. I was just an obstacle in a beige cardigan, an old woman lingering too long in front of the grains. I realized then that invisibility isn't something that happens to you overnight. It is a slow, silent accumulation of people looking through you until your physical presence no longer registers on their radar. I drove home slowly, the headlights of oncoming cars reflecting off the wet pavement like spilled oil. The house was cold when I entered. Ever since Curtis passed away 3 years ago, the silence of the 5-bedroom colonial had grown heavier, settling into the corners of the rooms like dust. It was too much space for one person, yet it was never mine. The guest rooms were permanently staged for grandchildren who left sticky fingerprints on the banisters, and the basement was cluttered with Calvin's old college furniture, which he had temporarily stored here 5 years ago. I spent an hour unpacking the groceries, carefully separating them into 3 neat piles on the kitchen island. I put Monica's organic produce into reusable canvas bags. I organized Toby's snacks into small, labeled containers so they would be ready for the morning rush. My own small carton of milk went into the corner of the refrigerator door. Nearly hidden behind the gallons of whole milk I kept stocked for the kids. By midnight, my lower back was a dull, burning ache. I sat at the small kitchen desk, looking at the calendar. Every square was filled with ink that wasn't my own. Tuesday, Maeve, 6:30 a.m., Toby, 8 a.m., Monica pickup, 6 p.m., Calvin, dinner? Wednesday, Toby, speech therapy, 2 p.m., grocery run for Calvin. Thursday, Maeve, piano, 4:15 p.m., Mitchell, late flight. There were no entries for Lorraine. I looked at a framed photograph on the desk. It was taken 12 years ago at Curtis's 65th birthday party. We were standing in the backyard, surrounded by our adult children. Monica was looking at her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. Calvin was looking off to the side, his hand deep in his pocket, seemingly wishing he were anywhere else. Curtis had his arm around my shoulder, but his eyes were tired, already clouded by the early stages of the illness that would eventually take him. Only I was looking directly at the camera. I had a smile on my face, but even now, looking at the print, I could see the tension in my jaw. I had spent 3 days preparing the food for that party, cleaning the house, and coordinating the parking. No one had offered to help with the dishes that night. They had simply kissed our cheeks, complained about the traffic on the interstate, and left us with a kitchen full of dirty platters. "You do it so well, Mom," Monica had said as she carried a leftover container of lemon tart to her car. "You're just so organized." It is a dangerous thing when your family turns your sacrifice into a personality trait. Once they decide you are strong or capable, they no longer feel the need to ask if you are tired. They assume your endurance is infinite, that your love is a well that never runs dry, regardless of how many buckets they lower into it. At 5:45 a.m., the alarm on my phone went off. The morning air was damp and gray. I pulled on a pair of soft trousers and a thick woolen sweater, my movements slow and deliberate. I brewed a pot of coffee, the smell of the dark roast doing little to clear the fog in my head. My fingers were stiff, the joints in my hands swollen from the autumn chill. At exactly 6:28 a.m., the headlights of Monica's luxury SUV swept across my kitchen window. I heard the heavy thud of the car door, followed by the rapid, sharp click of her heels on the concrete walkway. She didn't knock. She used her spare key, pushing the door open with her elbow while holding an insulated coffee mug in one hand and her work tote in the other. 8-year-old Maeve dragged behind her, her shoelaces trailing in the wet leaves on the porch, her eyes half closed and her iPad clutched tightly to her chest. "She hasn't eaten breakfast," Monica said, her voice a rapid-fire clip as she dropped Maeve's pink backpack onto the clean kitchen counter, knocking over a small vase of dried lavender I had placed there. "She wanted sugar cereal, but I told her no. Give her oatmeal with flaxseed. Oh, and Mom, can you make sure she does her reading comprehension worksheet before Calvin gets here? Toby is so loud, she won't be able to concentrate once he's in the house." Monica didn't take off her coat. She stood by the island, checking her watch, her eyes scanning the neat bags of groceries I had prepared. "You got the sparkling water?" she asked, reaching into the bag to check the label. "Perfect. I'll take these now so I don't have to come in tonight. Mitchell might be late, so I might need you to keep Maeve until 8. Is that okay? You don't have plans, right?" She didn't wait for my response. She was already leaning down to give Maeve a distracted peck on the crown of her head. "Be good for Grandma, sweetie. Don't let her give you any of that processed juice." Monica turned toward the door, her coat swirling behind her. She was 3 steps out when she stopped, looking back over her shoulder as if she had forgotten something. For a brief second, I thought she might ask how my back was, or if I had slept well. "Don't forget the reading worksheet, Mom," she said, her voice dropping into that familiar, functional register. "Her teacher says she's falling behind." The door clicked shut. Maeve didn't look up from her iPad. She climbed onto the bar stool, her small fingers tapping the screen as the bright colors of a cartoon reflected in her eyes. "Grandma, I'm hungry," she said, her voice flat, devoid of interest. I stood by the sink, looking at the dried lavender buds scattered across the marble counter. One of the small glass stems had cracked when Monica's heavy leather tote hit it. A single drop of spilled coffee from Monica's mug was slowly spreading across my grocery list, turning the neat blue ink of my handwriting into a dark, illegible smudge. I looked at my phone on the counter. It was 6:40 a.m. In 20 minutes, Calvin would call to tell me he was running 15 minutes late, which really meant 45. He would ask if I could wash a load of Toby's clothes because their washer was making a strange noise. He would expect me to say yes. He would expect me to smile, to open the door, to take his son, and to absorb yet another day of their chaotic, untidy lives while they went about the business of being young, successful, and busy. My hand was trembling slightly as I picked up the phone. The battery icon was full, a bright green bar in the upper corner. I looked at the screen, at the notifications already beginning to pile up. A text from Calvin about Toby's inhaler. An email about a dental appointment I had canceled 3 times to watch the children. A reminder that the lawn needed mowing. I didn't answer Calvin's text. Instead, I pressed the small button on the side of the metal casing. I held it down, watching the screen dim, then flicker, until the small white logo appeared and then vanished into a deep, glossy black. The silence that followed was immediate, and it was absolute. Maeve didn't notice the phone screen go dark. She didn't look up when I placed the black rectangle face down on the microwave shelf, high enough that it was out of sight, but low enough that I would have to make a conscious effort to reach for it. "Grandma, there's no brown sugar," Maeve said, her eyes still locked on the animated screen of her iPad. The blue light from the tablet cast a pale, synthetic glow across her small face, making her look older and strangely distant. "There is cinnamon," I said, my voice quiet in the high-ceilinged kitchen, "and some honey from the farmer's market." She let out a small, sharp sigh, a perfect imitation of her mother's sound of mild inconvenience. "Mom lets me have the organic maple syrup." "Your mother forgot to leave it," I lied. The syrup was in the pantry, but today, for some reason, the energy required to lift my arm, reach the top shelf, and unscrew the sticky cap felt like a weight I wasn't prepared to carry. I stirred the oats in the small copper pot. The steam rose, carrying the faint, earthy scent of grain. It was a smell that took me back 30 years, to mornings when Monica and Calvin were small, when the kitchen smelled of toast and wet rain gear, and when the bus schedule was the absolute law of our lives. In those days, I had believed that the exhaustion was temporary. I had told myself that once they grew up, once they had their own lives and their own homes, I would finally sit in a quiet room and read the books that had sat on my nightstand for a decade. I didn't know then that adult children don't leave. They simply expand. They return with larger demands, more complicated crises, and a modern, polite brand of entitlement that is far harder to refuse because it is wrapped in the language of family duty. "Here," I said, sliding the bowl of oatmeal in front of her. She didn't reach for the spoon. Her left hand remained curled around the edge of her tablet, her thumb twitching rhythmically. "Can you feed me? My hands are cold." She was 8 years old. "Your hands will warm up once you start eating," I said. I sat down opposite her, my own cup of coffee untouched. She looked at me then, her small brow furrowing in genuine confusion. Usually I would have laughed, taken the spoon, blown on the hot cereal, and turned it into a game. I would have felt that familiar nagging guilt that I wasn't being fun enough, that I was letting her grow up too fast. But today, the guilt didn't come. There was only a vast, flat landscape of fatigue. "You're being weird, Grandma," she murmured, finally picking up the spoon with a limp grip. At 7:45 a.m., the front door lock clicked again. There was no knock. There was only the heavy, hurried step of my son Calvin, followed by the dragging sound of Toby's oversized sneakers. Calvin didn't carry his son. He guided him by the shoulder, his hand already reaching into his pocket for his own vibrating phone before he had even crossed the threshold. "Mom, I've been calling you," Calvin said, his voice loud and slightly breathless. He was 36, but he still carried the faint, chaotic air of a teenager who had slept through his alarm. He was wearing his work lanyard, the plastic badge swinging against his chest like a pendulum. "I texted you 3 times. I thought you were at the grocery store, but your car is in the driveway." "My phone is off," I said. Calvin stopped in the middle of the kitchen, his brow furrowing. He looked at me, then at the microwave, where the phone lay face down, and then back at me. He looked genuinely baffled, as if I had just told him I had decided to start speaking in a foreign language. "Off? Why would it be off? What if something happened?" He set Toby's blue canvas bag on the floor with a heavy thud. "I had to drive all the way here without knowing if you were even awake. I've got a 9 o'clock meeting with the regional director, Mom. I can't be dealing with communication issues today." "I am awake," I said. My voice was level, almost completely devoid of inflection. "And Toby is here." Toby, who was 6, walked over to the sofa and immediately slumped onto the cushions, his head resting on the armrest. He didn't say hello. He looked pale, the small red patches of eczema on his wrists angry and inflamed against his skin. "Did you get his ointment?" Calvin asked, already moving toward the refrigerator, opening the door without asking and scanning the shelves. I didn't have time to stop at the pharmacy. The refill was ready yesterday, but Denise was supposed to pick it up, and she didn't, and then we had this whole argument about the child support structure. "It's on the counter," I cut in. "I picked it up last night." Calvin paused, his hand on the milk carton. He turned his head slowly, looking at the small white paper bag from the pharmacy that sat next to the cracked lavender. A brief flicker of something resembling relief, or perhaps just the automatic satisfaction of a need met, passed over his face. "Oh, good. Thanks." He took a quick sip of milk straight from the carton, a habit I had spent 20 years trying to break him of, and then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Listen, Denise is picking him up at 3, or maybe 4. It depends on when her shift ends at the clinic. If she's late, can you just feed him dinner? Nothing with dairy. You know how his stomach gets." "Calvin," I said. He was already halfway to the door, his phone in his hand, his thumb working the screen with rapid, nervous movements. "Yeah, Mom? What is it? I really have to run." "Your sister dropped Maeve off at 6:30. He stopped, his hand on the doorknob. He looked back at Maeve, who was still staring at her screen, then at Toby, who had curled into a tight ball on the sofa. "So," Calvin said, his tone defensive, "what's that got to do with me? Monica always gets her schedule prioritized. I've told you, Mom, my job is just as demanding as hers. Just because she works at a fancy gallery doesn't mean my logistics meetings don't matter." He didn't see the 2 children. He didn't see his mother's swollen knuckles. He only saw a competition for resources, specifically my time. "I am 68, Calvin," I said quietly. He stared at me for a second, his keys jingling in his hand. The silence in the kitchen grew heavy, the only sound the faint, tinny music from Maeve's iPad. For a moment, a tiny, fragile look of discomfort crossed his face. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Yeah, I know, Mom," he said, his voice dropping slightly, though the impatience remained just beneath the surface. "We appreciate it. Really, we do. I'll talk to Denise about the pickup time." He opened the door and was gone before I could reply. I stood there in the quiet of the morning. The 2 children were in my house, but they were not with me. They were anchored to their screens, silent and demanding, expecting the invisible machinery of my home to keep them warm, fed, and safe, without ever requiring them to look at the woman who turned the gears. I walked over to the sofa. Toby's shoes were still on, his dirty soles resting on the pale beige fabric of the cushions Curtis and I had bought when we retired. Usually, I would have gently removed them, carried them to the mudroom, and wiped down the fabric with a damp cloth. Instead, I sat down in the green armchair opposite him. I watched the small rise and fall of his chest. I looked at the dust motes dancing in the gray light that filtered through the window. And then, from the dark, narrow hallway near the coat closet, a sound broke the silence. It was a sharp, high-pitched ring, the old landline. The copper wire phone we had installed in 1982, the one I had kept active only because the security system required it, the number almost no one had anymore. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Maeve didn't look up. Toby didn't move. The sound was loud, archaic, and persistent, echoing through the cold, empty spaces of the house like a voice from a time when we still knew how to talk to one another. The hallway was narrower than the rest of the house, a dark artery connecting the kitchen to the formal dining room we rarely used anymore. The telephone sat on a small cherry wood table Curtis had built in his 2nd year of apprenticeship. It was a sturdy little piece of furniture, but over the years the varnish had worn away where our palms rested while we wrote down messages. I picked up the heavy receiver. The plastic was cool and solid against my ear, a stark contrast to the lightweight, fragile feel of modern smartphones. "Lorraine?" The voice was older, dry and measured, like paper that had been left in a drawer too long. It was Warren Vance. Warren had been Curtis's attorney for 30 years, and after Curtis died, he became mine. He was one of the few people who still called this number. "Yes, Warren, I'm here." "I was trying your cell phone," he said, a gentle note of curiosity in his tone. "It went straight to voicemail. I wanted to make sure I had the right day. We still have our appointment at 11? "We do," I said, looking down at the small notepad next to the phone. The top sheet was blank, but the pages beneath it bore the deep, indented ghosts of old grocery lists, pharmacy numbers, and school pickup times from months ago. "I will be there." "Good," Warren said. "I've got the preliminary valuation from the appraiser, and the structural report came through this morning. If you're still intent on this, Lorraine, we should have everything finalized before the winter utility bills start coming in. But I have to ask, have you spoken to Monica and Calvin yet?" I looked through the doorway into the living room. From my position in the hall, I could see Toby's small feet, still clad in his muddy sneakers, resting on the beige sofa. Just beyond him, the back of Maeve's head was visible over the top of the bar stool. Neither of them had moved. They existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the world to serve them. "No," I said quietly into the receiver, "I haven't told them." "Lorraine, they're going to find out eventually," Warren warned gently. "The sign goes in the yard next week. The listing will be public. If they see it on the market without warning—" "They don't look at the yard, Warren," I said, and for the first time in months, a small, cold amusement touched my voice. "They only look at the door when they're opening it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Warren had known Curtis well. He knew how this house had been built, how Curtis had spent his weekends pouring the concrete for the patio and shingling the roof, while I managed the budget down to the penny. He knew how much of our lives was sunk into these four walls. "All right," Warren said softly. "I'll see you at 11 then." "Thank you, Warren." I hung up the phone, the mechanical clack of the cradle ending the connection. A mother's patience is often mistaken for a lack of options. Because we stay, because we wash the dishes and fold the laundry and keep the pantry stocked with the specific brand of crackers our grandchildren prefer, our children assume we have nowhere else to go. They look at our graying hair and our slow movements, and they see a permanent fixture of the landscape. They think we are bound to the soil of our kitchens by some biological law. They don't realize that the walls only stand because we choose to hold them up. I walked back into the kitchen. Maeve was poking at her cold oatmeal with the tip of her finger, her expression sour. "It's cold," she said, looking up at me as if I had personally insulted her. "And it's slimy." "Then don't eat it," I said. She blinked, her finger freezing mid-poke. In her 8 years of life, Maeve had never heard me say those words. Usually, her complaints were met with a flurry of maternal anxiety, me rushing to microwave the bowl, offering to make toast instead, or apologizing for not having the right kind of syrup. "But I'm hungry," she said, her voice rising into a whiny pitch. "The bread is in the drawer, the toaster is on the counter, you know how to use it." I didn't look at her as I spoke. I began wiping down the counter, moving Monica's canvas grocery bags to the floor near the pantry. "Mom says I'm too young to use the toaster by myself," Maeve said, her lower lip beginning to protrude. "She says I'll burn myself." "Then you can wait until your mother comes back to make it for you," I said. My voice was calm, entirely empty of the warmth she was used to leveraging. She stared at me, her small face twisting in a mix of confusion and anger. She didn't have the vocabulary to understand what was happening, but she could feel the temperature in the room dropping. The soft, accommodating grandmother she had known since she was a baby had suddenly become something else, something solid and unyielding, like the brick wall behind the stove. From the living room, Toby let out a soft, congested whimper. I walked over to the sofa. He had rolled over, his face pressed into the fabric of the cushion. The red patches on his neck were raw from where he had been scratching them in his sleep. "Grandma, my neck hurts," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep and congestion. "It's itchy." I looked down at him. For 30 years, my immediate physical response to a child's pain had been a chemical surge of worry. I would have scooped him up, held his small, warm body against mine, and carried him to the bathroom to apply the cool cream. I would have whispered soft, meaningless promises that everything was going to be fine. But as I looked at Toby, I didn't feel that rush. I felt only a profound, crystalline stillness. I thought of Calvin's ex-wife, Denise, who had called me 3 weeks ago at midnight, sobbing because Calvin hadn't paid his share of the utility bill and her lights were going to be turned off. I had transferred $500 to her account before the sun came up. She hadn't called to thank me. When I saw her 2 days later, she complained that the grocery store near my house didn't carry the organic milk she preferred. I thought of Calvin, who had bought a brand new set of golf clubs last month, while his son's medical bills sat unpaid on my kitchen desk. "The ointment is in the small white bag on the kitchen counter, Toby," I said. My voice was gentle, but it carried no invitation for him to climb into my lap. "Go bring it to me, and I'll help you put it on." Toby looked up, his small blue eyes wide and watery. He expected me to fetch it. He expected me to do the walking, the carrying, the soothing. He waited, perhaps thinking I was testing him. But I didn't move. I stood by the edge of the rug, my hands folded loosely in front of me, watching him with the quiet, detached curiosity of a stranger. Slowly, reluctantly, he dragged his feet off the sofa. His dirty sneakers hit the hardwood floor with a soft slap. He walked toward the kitchen, his shoulders slumped, his small hand reaching up to scratch his raw neck. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:15 a.m. In less than 3 hours, I had to be in Warren's office. I had to sign the papers that would put this house, the house Curtis and I had bought for $42,000 in 1978, the house that was now worth nearly $700,000, on the market. Monica and Calvin believed they were the rightful heirs to this space. They had already divided the rooms in their minds. Monica had once mentioned, during a casual Sunday dinner, how the dining room would make a perfect home office for Mitchell once I moved into something smaller. Calvin had eyed Curtis's workshop in the garage, suggesting he might store his motorcycle there permanently. They had already carved up my life like a Sunday roast, leaving me with only the bones. They didn't know that Curtis had left the deed entirely in my name. They didn't know that the trust he had set up was under my sole control. They assumed, with the easy ignorance of youth, that mothers do not make financial decisions without consulting their children first. I walked into the hallway, reached up to the shelf in the coat closet, and pulled down my small black leather purse. Inside, wrapped in a faded piece of tissue paper, was the spare key to the house. I looked at it for a long moment, the brass cold against my palm, before sliding it into my pocket. The ointment tube was cold and stiff from the morning drafts in the kitchen. I squeezed a small pearlescent dollop of the steroid cream onto my index finger. Toby stood before me, his small chin tucked down, his eyes fixed on my old leather shoes. His neck was a patchwork of dry, angry pink scales. "Chin up, Toby," I said. My voice was quiet, but it had a clean, firm edge to it. He lifted his head. I began to apply the cream, my touch light and methodical. For years I had turned this simple task into a performance. I would make silly clicking noises, pretend my finger was a spaceship landing on his skin, or sing a little rhyme Curtis used to sing to our children when they had scraped knees. I had believed that a grandmother's job was to sugarcoat the small miseries of childhood, to make the world seem softer than it actually was. Today, I did it in silence. "It burns a little," he whispered, his eyes swelling with tears. He looked up at me, waiting for the flurry of sympathy, the promises of cookies or television that usually followed. "I know," I said, gently smoothing the cream over his collarbone, "but it will help. You have to keep your hands away from it now. If you scratch it, it will bleed." He blinked at me, his tears held in suspension. He seemed confused by the lack of theater. When I finished, I wiped my finger on a piece of paper towel, folded it, and handed the tube to him. "Keep this in your bag," I said. "You're 6 now. You can show your mother where it is when she picks you up." He took the tube with both hands, staring down at it as if I had just handed him a heavy stone. I walked over to the hallway. The landline telephone sat on its cherry wood table, waiting. I lifted the receiver and dialed Monica's cell phone. I didn't have her gallery number memorized, but I knew her cell number by heart. I had paid the bill for it until she was 26. It rang 4 times before she answered. In the background, I could hear the echo of a high-ceilinged space and the faint, rhythmic scraping of a broom on concrete. "Mom, I'm in the middle of setting up the west wall," she said, her voice tight and breathless. "Is everything okay? Did Maeve eat her oatmeal?" "Monica," I said, "I need you to come pick up Maeve. And you need to call Calvin and tell him to get Toby." There was a sudden, sharp silence on the other end of the line. The sweeping sound in the background stopped. "What? What are you talking about? I just dropped her off 20 minutes ago." "I have an appointment at 11 o'clock, I said. "I need to leave the house by 10:15 to make it on time. The children cannot stay here alone." "An appointment? For what?" Her tone shifted from busy to irritated, the natural defensive crouch of someone whose convenience had been threatened. "Can't you reschedule it? You know this is the opening week of the winter exhibition. Mitchell is in meetings all day, and I can't just leave the gallery. Surely whatever it is can wait until Friday." "No," I said, "it cannot wait." "Mom, are you being serious right now?" Her voice rose, a sharp, patronizing pitch that made my chest tighten, though my face remained perfectly still. "What is so important that you're willing to leave me stranded like this? Is it your doctor? If it's your blood pressure, you should have told me." "My health is fine, Monica," I said, cutting her off before she could build a tower of manufactured concern to guilt me with. "But I have a commitment at 11. I am telling you now at 8:30, so you have nearly 2 hours to make arrangements. If you cannot come, you must contact Calvin or Denise, but the house will be locked and I will be gone by 10:15. You're locking the house?" She sounded incredulous, as if I had just suggested I was going to set fire to the curtains. "With the kids? Mom, this is ridiculous. You're acting completely unreasonable. What is going on with you lately? Ever since Dad died, you've been so cold." There it was, the ancient weapon. When adult children run out of practical arguments, they reach for the emotional ledger. They remind you of your grief, or they accuse you of changing, as if the person you were before, the one who never complained, who never said no, who carried their burdens without a word, was the only version of you that had a right to exist. When you have spent decades saying yes out of habit, I said softly, your first no sounds like a declaration of war. What is that supposed to mean? Monica snapped. Are you quoting something? Look, I don't have time for this. I'll call Calvin, but he's not going to be happy. You're putting us both in an impossible position, Mom. Truly. 10:15, Monica, I said. I hung up the receiver before she could answer. I didn't slam it down. I placed it gently back into its cradle, the metal bell inside giving a tiny, muted chime. I walked back into the living room. Maeve was sitting on the bar stool, her iPad neglected on the counter. She had been listening. Children have an extraordinary radar for shifts in parental authority, and she looked at me now with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Are we going somewhere, Grandma? She asked. I am, I said. Your mother or your father is coming to get you. But it's raining, she said, looking out the sliding glass door that led to the patio. The rain had picked up, a steady gray sheet that blurred the outline of the old maple tree in the backyard. Yes, I said, it is. I went to the front closet. I pulled my dark wool coat, the heavy charcoal-colored one I had bought for Curtis's funeral, from its wooden hanger. I shook out the sleeves. It smelled faintly of cedar and the lavender sachets I kept in the cedar chest, a scent of preservation and quiet endings. I put it on, buttoning it slowly from the hem to the collar. The two children watched me from the living room. Toby was still holding his tube of ointment, his small fingers pressing into the soft plastic. Maeve had slid off her bar stool and was standing near the edge of the rug, her hands tucked into her pockets. For the first time in their lives, they saw me dressed for the world outside. I wasn't in my kitchen apron. I wasn't in my old garden sneakers. I was a woman in a dark coat, standing by the door with her keys in her hand, looking at them from a distance that could not be measured in feet. And then the landline began to ring again. The landline rang 12 times before it stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost physical, broken only by the steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the clogged gutter right outside the hallway window. Maeve and Toby stood in the living room, their eyes darting between me and the silent telephone. Aren't you going to answer it, Grandma? Maeve asked. Her voice had lost its whiny, demanding edge. It was smaller now, thin and tentative. No, I said. I didn't explain. I didn't tell her that it was likely her father, Calvin, calling to rage at me, or her mother calling back to try a different, softer angle of manipulation. When you stop justifying your actions to people who only value you for your utility, you reclaim a vast amount of quiet space. You realize that no is a complete sentence, one that doesn't require a footnote or an apology. I walked down the short carpeted hallway to the den, the room Curtis had used as his retreat. It still smelled of his pipe tobacco, cherry blend, though he hadn't smoked in 5 years before his death. On his mahogany roll-top desk sat a manila folder. I had retrieved it earlier, before the children arrived. Inside the folder were the documents Warren Vance had prepared for our 11 o'clock meeting. But beneath the real estate agreement was another set of papers, older, their edges slightly yellowed. They were the financial ledgers of Curtis's estate, along with the records of the monthly transfers I had made to both Monica and Calvin over the last 3 years. $36,000 to Monica for emergency roof repairs that had somehow turned into a saltwater pool installation. $22,000 to Calvin to settle his back taxes, which he had promised to pay back within 6 months. That was 2 years ago. And then there were the smaller, invisible numbers, the weekly grocery bills, the utility payments for Denise's apartment, the piano lessons for Maeve, the speech therapy sessions for Toby that Calvin's insurance didn't cover. I had kept every receipt. I had noted every date, not out of malice, but because Curtis had taught me that a clear account of the truth is the only protection a quiet person has in a loud world. I tucked the folder under my arm and walked back to the kitchen. At 9:45 a.m., a car came up the driveway too fast. Its tires spraying wet gravel against the garage door. I didn't need to look out the window to know it was Calvin's sedan. The muffler had been loose for months, a low metallic rattle he had ignored because he was too busy to take it to the shop. The car door slammed. The front door of the house was pushed open with such force that the brass doorstop struck the baseboard with a sharp thwack. Calvin stood in the entryway, his hair damp from the rain, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He was wearing his work jacket over his dress shirt, his tie slightly crooked. His face was flushed, his eyes wild with the kind of frantic, self-absorbed panic that usually characterized his financial crises. "What the hell, Mom?" he yelled, not caring that both Maeve and Toby were standing right there. He swiped a hand through his wet hair. "Monica called me screaming. She says you're kicking the kids out? That you're locking the doors? I had to leave a regional logistics call for this. Do you have any idea what my boss is going to say?" I stood by the kitchen island, the manila folder held firmly against my side. I looked at him. For 36 years, this was the moment where my chest would have tightened. I would have felt the familiar hot rush of motherly shame, the instinctive need to pacify him, to explain myself, to apologize for causing him trouble. I would have said, "I'm sorry, Calvin. I didn't mean to disrupt your work. Let me explain." But as I looked at him now, I felt nothing but a quiet, clinical detachment. He looked so small, standing in the doorway of the house Curtis had built, screaming at the woman who had washed his clothes and paid his debts. "Toby's bag is by the sofa, Calvin," I said. My voice was low, even, and entirely devoid of anger. "Maeve's backpack is on the counter. Take them." "Take them? Where?" Calvin's voice cracked. He took 2 steps into the kitchen, his wet shoes leaving dark, muddy prints on my clean floor. "I can't take them to work, Mom, and Denise's shift doesn't end until 3. What am I supposed to do with them? Put them in the back of my car?" "That is for you and Monica to decide," I said. "You are their parents." "We are in the middle of our careers," he shouted, his arms flinging wide. "We are trying to build lives here. You're retired, Mom. You sit in this house all day doing nothing. Why are you doing this to us? What did we do to you?" The question was so revealing, so profoundly selfish, that it almost made me smile. What did we do to you? They had done nothing active. They hadn't beaten me. They hadn't stolen my money through fraud. They hadn't used physical violence. They had simply done what most families do to the silent ones. They had consumed me. They had taken my time, my energy, my money, and my peace, bite by bite, year by year, until there was nothing left but a shell. And then they had complained that the shell wasn't cheerful enough. "A child's anger at an aging parent," I said, looking him directly in the eyes, "is often just the panic of realizing they might have to carry their own weight." Calvin stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked as if I had just struck him. His chest heaved, but the loud, righteous anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a strange, hollow confusion. He had never seen me like this. He had no script for a mother who didn't care about his excuses. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking again, this time with a faint note of fear. Are you having a stroke? Is something wrong with your head?" "No, Calvin," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out my car keys. The metal jingled softly in the quiet kitchen. "My head is clearer than it has been in 40 years. I walked past him. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look at the children as I passed the living room. I knew that if I looked at Toby's wet eyes or Maeve's confused face, the old biological habits of guilt would try to claw their way back up my throat. "Get your bags," I heard Calvin say to the kids behind me, his voice tight and trembling with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "We're leaving." I walked out the front door and onto the porch. The damp, cold air hit my face, clean and sharp. I walked down the concrete steps, the rain light against my dark wool coat, and climbed into the driver's seat of my sedan. I placed the manila folder on the passenger seat. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I watched Calvin emerge from the house. He was carrying Toby's blue bag in one hand, while his other hand gripped Toby's small shoulder, guiding him quickly through the drizzle. Maeve walked behind them, her pink backpack slung over one shoulder, her head down, her iPad tucked under her arm. Calvin stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at my car. He didn't move. He stood there in the rain, his son's hand clutched in his, looking at the dark-tinted glass of my windshield as if he were trying to see the face of the woman inside. But the reflection of the gray sky was too strong, and he could see nothing but the rain. I started the engine, shifted into reverse, and slowly backed down the gravel driveway, leaving him standing there in the cold, wet air of the morning he thought I would manage for him. The windshield wipers kept a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the glass. Thump, shuck, thump, shuck. I drove through the familiar streets of our small town, past the community park where Curtis used to coach Calvin's Little League games, past the bakery where I had bought Monica's birthday cakes for 20 years. Everything looked slightly blurred through the gray curtain of rain, like a photograph that had been left in the sun until the colors began to bleed. My mind went back to the week after Curtis's funeral, 3 years ago. The house had been filled with people for 3 days. Neighbors brought casseroles. Church members left cards. Monica and Calvin sat on the sofa, looking solemn and receiving condolences with the practiced grace of people who knew they were being watched. But by the 4th day, the house was empty. The casseroles were gone, replaced by a mountain of dirty foil pans in the sink. On that 4th afternoon, Monica had walked into the kitchen while I was washing the 3rd load of coffee cups. She didn't pick up a dish towel. Instead, she sat at the kitchen island, pulling a small notebook from her purse. "Mom," she had said, her voice dropping into that gentle, administrative tone she used when she wanted to sound mature. "We need to talk about the plan. Mitchell says we should look into the tax implications of the house sooner rather than later. If we put it in a trust for the kids now, we can avoid probate when, you know." when the time comes." "When I die, you mean," I had said, my hands still in the soapy water. She had blushed slightly, but she hadn't denied it. "We're just trying to be practical, Mom. It's what Dad would have wanted. He was always so careful about his estate, and Calvin's really struggling with his rent right now. If we could sell some of Dad's tools, or maybe look into a home equity line, we could help him get on his feet." They hadn't asked how I had slept. They hadn't asked if the empty side of the bed felt like a cold stone beside me. They had looked at the grief-stricken widow and seen only a probate problem, a collection of assets waiting to be redistributed. I turned the sedan into the gravel parking lot of Warren Vance's office. The building was a restored Victorian, painted a quiet slate blue, with a small brass plaque beside the door that read, "Vance and Associates, Attorneys at Law." It was the kind of place where the floorboards creaked under the carpet, and the air smelled faintly of old parchment, leather polish, and wet umbrellas. I turned off the engine. The silence in the car was immediate, deep, and comforting. I sat for a moment, looking at the manila folder on the passenger seat before reaching over to tuck it under my arm. Inside the building, the warmth of the radiator hit me, bringing with it the dry, dusty scent of legal files. Warren's receptionist, a woman named Beverly, who had worked there since Curtis and I had first written our wills in 1982, gave me a soft, sympathetic smile. "He's waiting for you, Lorraine," she said, her voice a quiet murmur. "Go right on back." Warren's office was at the end of the hall. He was sitting behind a massive oak desk, his gold-rimmed reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose, his green banker's lamp casting a warm, triangular glow over a stack of documents. When I entered, he stood up immediately, smoothing his tweed jacket. "Lorraine," he said, walking around the desk to shake my hand. His grip was dry and firm. Come in. Let me take your coat." "Thank you, Warren," I said, unbuttoning the heavy wool and handing it to him. He hung it on the brass tree in the corner, next to his own trench coat, before gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather wingback chairs opposite his desk. I placed the manila folder in my lap, my hands resting on the smooth cardstock. "I have the final disclosures here," Warren said, sitting back down and pulling a set of stapled pages toward him. He adjusted his glasses. The appraiser's final figure came in at $695,000. Given the current market and the lack of inventory in your neighborhood, we could likely list it for $715 and expect multiple offers within the week. The structural report is clean. Curtis built that foundation to last a century, and it shows. "He did," I whispered. "He always said if you do it right the first time, you don't have to spend your life fixing your mistakes." "He was a smart man, Lorraine," Warren said gently. He looked at me over the rims of his glasses, his expression softening. "And you're sure about this? Once we sign these, the listing goes live on Monday. The lockbox goes on the door. It becomes very real." "I am sure," I said. "And you still haven't told the children?" "They know I had an appointment today," I said, a faint, dry smile touching my lips. "They don't know what it was for." "They're going to be angry, Lorraine," Warren said. He wasn't advising me against it. He was simply stating a legal and personal fact. They've lived under the assumption that this house was their safety net. Calvin especially. He's been relying on your financial backing more than is healthy for a man his age. I know, I said, but a safety net is only useful if the person holding it can stand the strain. I am 68, Warren. My back hurts when I stand too long. My knees throb when the rain comes. I cannot carry 2 grown families on my shoulders anymore. You shouldn't have to, Warren said. He slid the document toward me, pointing to the line at the bottom of the page. A small yellow sticky arrow pointed to the blank space beside my name. Lorraine M. Miller, Executor and Sole Trustee. I picked up the heavy black pen Warren offered. The ink flowed smoothly, a dark, permanent line that bound my decision to the page. Lorraine M. Miller. As I finished the last stroke, I felt a strange physical sensation in my chest, not of loss, but of lightness. It was as if a heavy, wet blanket had been lifted from my shoulders, allowing me to take a full, deep breath of air for the first time in years. There, Warren said, taking the document back and checking the signature. Now on to the second part of our agenda. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a smaller, blue-jacketed folder. He opened it, revealing a purchase agreement for a small 2-bedroom cottage in a coastal town 3 hours north of here. It was a quiet place, with a small garden plot and a view of the salt marshes. I had visited it in secret 3 weeks ago, during a weekend when Monica thought I was attending a senior center retreat. The seller accepted your offer, Warren said, a small smile appearing on his face. No contingencies, cash sale. Since the funds from Curtis's investment trust are already cleared, we can close on this next Tuesday. You can have the keys by Wednesday afternoon. I looked at the photograph of the cottage stapled to the inside cover. It had white clapboard siding and a small covered porch, just big enough for 1 rocking chair. There was no room for guests. There was no basement for Calvin's old furniture. There was only space for me, my books, and the silence I had spent a lifetime earning. Before I could speak, the intercom on Warren's desk gave a sharp plastic buzz. Warren reached over and pressed the button. Yes, Beverly? Warren, Beverly's voice came through the speaker, sounding uncharacteristically tense. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have Monica Miller on line 2. She's very frantic, Warren. She says her mother's cell phone is turned off, and she's been calling every doctor's office and clinic in town. She wants to know if Lorraine is there. Warren looked up at me, his hand still resting on the intercom button, his eyes asking the silent question. The room was very quiet, save for the rain tapping against the window. Warren's hand hovered over the blinking red light on his telephone console. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation, any indication that I wanted him to shield me from the storm on the other end of the wire. Do you want me to take it, Lorraine? He asked quietly. I can tell her we're in a confidential signing and that you'll call her later. No, Warren, I said, my voice steady. Put her on speaker. He pressed the button with a soft click. The static of the line filled the warm, quiet office for a fraction of a second before Monica's voice erupted into the room, loud and metallic. Warren? Warren, is my mother there? Beverly said she was there. What is going on? Calvin is at my house right now with the kids. He had to leave his job, Warren. He's going to lose his contract over this. He says Mom went crazy, locked the doors, and drove off. I've been calling the hospital, the clinic. I was about to call the police. She was panting, her words tumbling over one another in a rush of frantic, self-important anger. I leaned forward slightly, closer to the small plastic console. "I am here, Monica." There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The background noise of the gallery seemed to vanish as she absorbed my voice. "Mom? Oh my God, Mom! What are you doing? What is wrong with you?" The panic in her voice was rapidly curdling into fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done today? You can't just turn off your phone and disappear. We thought you were dead in a ditch somewhere. And what is this about locking Calvin out? He had to drag Maeve and Toby out in the rain." "I did not lock Calvin out, Monica," I said. "I returned his son to him, and I left my house to attend a private appointment. I gave you both nearly 2 hours' notice." "A private appointment at a lawyer's office?" She spat back, her tone sharp with suspicion. "Why are you at Warren's? Are you sick? Is this about your will? If you're having some kind of cognitive issue, Mom, you need to tell us. You can't just make erratic decisions that affect the entire family." I looked at Warren. He was looking down at his desk, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of his legal pad, but his jaw was tight. "I am not sick, Monica," I said, "and my cognitive faculties are perfectly intact. I am at Warren's office because I have just signed the listing agreement to sell my house." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that occurs when a structural beam in a house suddenly snaps. Not a loud explosion, but a deep, hollow crack that signals the beginning of a collapse. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing, shallow and rapid, through the speaker. You're what?" she whispered. "I am selling the house," I repeated. "It will go on the market on Monday." "You can't do that," she said, her voice dropping into a hard, venomous register. "That's Dad's house. That's our family home. You can't just sell it without talking to us. Where are we supposed to go? Where are the kids supposed to stay when we're working?" "You will have to make other arrangements," I said. "As for the house, it is in my name. The deed is mine, and the decision is mine." "This is selfish," she hissed, her voice trembling. "This is incredibly, unbelievably selfish. You're 68 years old, Mom. What do you need all that money for anyway? You're just going to sit on it while your children struggle? Calvin can barely pay his rent. Mitchell and I are trying to get Maeve into a private academy." "For 40 years," I said, my voice cutting through her tirade like a cold wind, "I have been the foundation you built your convenience upon. But foundations eventually crack, Monica. I am tired of holding up a structure that doesn't even see me. The house is being sold. I suggest you call Calvin and start figuring out where he is going to store his furniture." "Mom!" I reached out and pressed the button on Warren's console. The line went dead. The red light stopped blinking. The room returned to its quiet warmth, but the air felt different now, lighter, clearer, like the atmosphere after a thunderstorm has finally broken. Warren looked up at me. He didn't smile, but there was a deep, quiet respect in his eyes. "She will call back," he said. "She will," I agreed. "And then she will call Calvin, and then they will both drive to my house. but I won't be there. I stood up, smoothing the front of my trousers. Warren walked around the desk to retrieve my heavy wool coat from the brass tree. He helped me into it, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "Take care of yourself, Lorraine," he said. "The next few weeks are going to be difficult. They won't make this easy for you." "They don't know how to make anything easy, Warren," I said, pulling my collar up against the draft. "But they don't have the power to stop me anymore." I walked out of the office, past Beverly, who kept her eyes carefully lowered as I passed her desk, though I knew she had heard every word. The rain was still falling when I left the building, but it had slowed to a soft silver mist. I climbed into my sedan, started the engine, and drove away from the Victorian office. I didn't go home. I knew that within 30 minutes, Calvin's car and Monica's SUV would be parked in my driveway, their engines idling, their occupants waiting to ambush me with tears, anger, and demands for an explanation I had already given. Instead, I drove to the Blue Star Diner on the edge of town. It was an old-fashioned place with chrome trim that had begun to pit and neon signs that flickered in the gray afternoon light. It smelled of fried onions, coffee, and wet coats. I slid into a vinyl booth near the back window, away from the door. An older waitress with tired eyes and a faded blue apron brought me a menu. "Just coffee, sweetie?" "A cup of black tea, please," I said, "and a slice of the apple pie, warmed." "You got it." I sat by the window, watching the rain pool in the gravel parking lot. I pulled my cell phone from my purse. It was still turned off, its black screen reflecting the yellow lights of the diner's kitchen. I hesitated for a long moment, my thumb resting on the power button, before finally turning it on. The screen flickered to life. Within seconds, the phone began to vibrate in my hand, a frantic, continuous shudder that felt like a trapped insect. "Missed call, Monica, 14. Missed call, Calvin, 9. Text message, Monica, how could you do this? Text message, Calvin, Mom, answer your phone right now." But among the flurry of angry red notifications, there was one that was different. It was an email alert from my bank, a notification of a large automated withdrawal that had cleared my account at noon. I opened it. It was the monthly mortgage payment for Calvin's townhome, the one I had co-signed for 3 years ago, the one where the payments were set up to draw automatically from my retirement account because Calvin always forgot to make the transfer. I looked at the number, $1,850. I tapped the screen, opening my banking app. I navigated to the recurring transfers menu, scrolled down to the bottom of the list, and tapped the button that read, Cancel Authorization. The app asked me if I was sure. I pressed yes. The apple pie was warm, the crust flaky and tasting faintly of lard and nutmeg. I ate it slowly, savoring each bite with a deliberate focus I hadn't allowed myself in years. For decades, my meals had been hurried affairs, eating the crusts off the children's sandwiches while standing over the sink, or swallowing cold soup between folding laundry and wiping down counters. To sit in a vinyl booth, listening to the rain on the diner's flat roof, and simply eat was an act of quiet rebellion. My phone vibrated on the table again. The screen lit up with Calvin's name. He had likely just received the notification from his bank. His mortgage company was aggressive. If the automatic draw failed on the first of the month, An automated text was sent to his phone within 10 minutes. I didn't answer. I slid my thumb across the screen, turning the power off once more. The black glass became a mirror again, reflecting the yellow neon sign of the diner. When you spend your life as an emotional and financial cushion, people do not see your withdrawal as a choice. They see it as a mechanical failure. They believe the machine has broken, and if they only kick it hard enough or scream at it loud enough, it will start working again. They do not understand that the machine has simply walked away. I paid the bill, leaving a generous tip for the tired waitress, and drove back to the house. The rain had stopped by the time I pulled into the driveway, leaving the asphalt shiny and black. The air was cold, smelling of wet earth and decaying maple leaves. The driveway was empty. Monica's SUV and Calvin's sedan were gone. They had likely gone back to Monica's house to convene a war council, to dissect my words and try to figure out how to handle their newly uncooperative mother. I walked up the porch steps and unlocked the door. The house was incredibly quiet. The silence was different now. It was no longer the heavy, stagnant air of a widow waiting for her life to finish. It felt like a stage after the actors had left, still, expectant, and clean. On the kitchen island, the cracked vase of dried lavender still sat next to the dark coffee stain Monica had left behind. In the living room, Toby's muddy footprints were dried gray on the pale rug. I didn't reach for the vacuum cleaner. I didn't get the spray bottle and the rag. I walked past the mess, up the carpeted stairs to the master bedroom. From the top of the closet, I pulled down 2 old leather suitcases. They had belonged to Curtis's parents, heavy and brown, with brass latches that popped open with a loud, satisfying clack. I opened them on the bed. Packing up a life is not about the boxes. It is about deciding which memories are worth the weight of carrying them into the future. I went to my dresser. I bypassed the practical, everyday clothes, the sensible sweaters, the cardigans I wore while cleaning. Instead, I packed my 3 best silk blouses, the wool trousers I had bought for our anniversary trip to Boston 5 years ago, and the silver hairbrush Curtis had given me when we were newlyweds. From the nightstand, I took my small cherrywood jewelry box. Inside were my grandmother's pearl earrings, a few gold bands, and Curtis's heavy silver pocket watch. He had inherited it from his father, and though he had stopped winding it years before his death, the weight of it in my palm was comforting, solid, cool, and real. I laid the watch gently between 2 soft woolen sweaters. As I was folding a green silk scarf, a sound from downstairs cut through the quiet of the bedroom. It was the front door. The lock turned, and then the heavy wood door creaked open. I didn't freeze. My heart didn't jump into my throat. I stood by the bed, the green silk still in my hands, listening to the footsteps below. They were light, hesitant, and uneven, not the aggressive, heavy tread of Calvin, nor the sharp, rapid click of Monica's heels. "Lorraine?" The voice was tentative, calling up the stairs with a quiet, nervous pitch. It was Denise. Denise, Calvin's ex-wife. She still had a key to the house. I had given her one 2 years ago, so she could drop Toby off on the mornings when Calvin was too overwhelmed to handle his own son's custody transition. "I'm upstairs, Denise," I called out. I heard her slow steps on the stairs. When she reached the landing, she stopped, her hand resting on the banister. She was wearing her nurse's scrubs under a damp nylon windbreaker, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as she looked at the 2 open suitcases on my bed. She looked at the leather bags, then at the green silk scarf in my hands, and then at me. "Monica called me," Denise said, her voice barely above a whisper. She said you're selling the house. She said you canceled Calvin's mortgage payment." "I did," I said. Denise closed her eyes for a brief second. Her shoulders sagged, the damp windbreaker rustling in the quiet room. She looked incredibly tired, the kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix, the bone-deep weariness of a woman who has spent years trying to keep her head above water while tied to a sinking man. "Lorraine," she said, her voice trembling, "if you sell the house, if you stop helping, Calvin isn't going to pay his child support. He's already 3 months behind. He's going to lose that townhome, and then he's going to move into my apartment, or he's going to stop seeing Toby altogether." She wasn't angry. She wasn't demanding like Monica. Her voice held only the flat, desperate panic of a survivor who has just seen her last lifeboat pull away from the ship. "I know," I said. Denise looked at me, a tear finally escaping her eye and rolling down her pale cheek, leaving a dark trail through her light makeup. "Then why? Why are you doing this to us?" I laid the green silk scarf down on top of the sweaters, smoothing the fabric with my palm. The silk was cool under my fingers, a delicate, expensive thing that felt entirely out of place in a room that was slowly being dismantled. "Denise," I said, turning to look at her, "I am not doing anything to you. I am simply stopping what I have been doing for everyone else." She leaned against the bedroom door frame, her fingers curling around the white painted wood. She looked so small in her oversized scrubs, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She was 32, but under the harsh overhead light of my bedroom, she looked 40. "But it's the same thing," she whispered, her voice cracking. "To people like me, who are barely hanging on, when you stop, we drown. I can't pay for Toby's medication and his speech therapy on my salary, Lorraine. I can't work double shifts at the clinic and be there when his school calls because he's had an eczema flare-up. I need you. Toby needs you." "You need a mother," I said gently, "and Toby needs a grandmother. But what you have been using me for is not motherhood, Denise. It is a buffer. I have been the cushion between Calvin's selfishness and your reality. Every time he failed to pay child support, I paid the bill. Every time he forgot to pick Toby up, I was the one who stood by the door waiting. Every time you two had an argument about money, I was the one who wrote the check to keep the peace." I walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. I didn't reach out to touch her. She was too fragile for comfort right now. Comfort would only make her cry harder, and she needed her strength. As long as I am standing here, catching him every time he falls, Calvin will never have to face the reality of his own life, I said. And you will keep expecting me to pay the price for his failures. But I am 68, Denise. I am tired. I do not want my final years to be spent managing the wreckage of my son's adulthood. "Sometimes," she murmured, looking down at her wet shoes, "the only way to save the people you love is to stop standing between them and the consequences of their choices." "Yes," I said, "and sometimes you have to save yourself first." She let out a long, ragged breath, her shoulders rising and falling. She didn't argue. She had been married to Calvin long enough to know the truth of what I was saying. She knew his charm, his excuses, his deep, bottomless capacity for taking without ever giving back. "Let's go downstairs," I said. "I'll make some tea." We walked down the creaking stairs together, our steps echoing in the quiet house. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. Denise sat at the island, her hands folded in her lap. She looked around the kitchen, at the clean counters, the empty fruit bowl, the cracked lavender buds still scattered near the sink. "It feels different in here," she said quietly. "Colder." "It's just empty," I said, placing 2 ceramic mugs on the counter. "When you take the noise away, you realize how much space there actually is." I sat down opposite her, sliding a mug of chamomile tea toward her. "I am selling this house, Denise. That is decided. The listing goes live on Monday. But I want you to listen to me very carefully." She looked up, her tea untouched, her eyes fixed on my face. "I have instructed Warren Vance to set up a private educational and medical trust for Toby," I said. "It will be funded from the proceeds of the sale of this house, $50,000. Denise gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Lorraine, no, you can't." "Let me finish," I said, my voice firm. "The trust will be under the sole management of Warren's office. You will submit Toby's medical bills, his therapy invoices, and his school fees directly to Warren, and the trust will pay them. Calvin will have no access to this money. He will not even know the exact amount. If he asks, you are to tell him that the trust is managed by an independent trustee and that you have no power to withdraw cash from it." A slow, deep relief seemed to wash over Denise's face. The tight, defensive lines around her mouth began to soften. She understood immediately what I had done. I hadn't abandoned Toby. I had protected him. And in doing so, I had stripped Calvin of his ability to use his son as a financial lever to extort money from me. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Lorraine, thank you. I didn't know. I thought you were just leaving us." "I am leaving," I said, "but I am not abandoning the people who actually need me. I am only removing myself from the path of the people who use me." Before she could reply, the gravel outside the kitchen window gave a loud, violent crunch. It was the sound of multiple tires turning quickly on the wet stones. I looked through the glass. Monica's large black SUV pulled in first, parking crookedly across the lawn. Right behind her was Calvin's sedan, his loose muffler rattling loudly in the damp afternoon air. Both cars came to a halt, their engines dying almost simultaneously. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw the doors open. Monica stepped out first. She wasn't wearing her work coat. She had a heavy knit sweater pulled over her shoulders, her face set in a hard, determined mask. From the other side of the SUV, Mitchell, her husband, climbed out, his face pale and uncomfortable. Calvin stepped out of his sedan, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. They stood in the driveway for a fraction of a second, a small, united front under the gray sky, before they began walking toward the porch steps. Their footsteps were heavy, loud, and coordinated. Denise looked at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp panic. "They're here," she whispered, her hand tightening around her tea mug. "Lorraine, what are you going to do?" I stood up from the bar stool. I smoothed my trousers, picked up my tea mug, and walked over to the sink to pour the remains down the drain. "I am going to let them in," I said. The front door didn't just open. It rebounded against the wall with a hollow wooden thud. Monica entered first, her eyes scanning the hallway before locking onto the kitchen. She froze for a split second when she saw Denise sitting at the island, her hands curled around her tea mug. The sudden, sharp contraction of Monica's features was almost clinical. The immediate, instinctual territorialism of a daughter who realized an outsider had been granted access to the fortress while the family had been kept at the gate. "Denise?" Monica said, her voice dropping into a cold, clipped register. "What are you doing here?" Denise didn't answer. She set her mug down on the counter, the ceramic making a soft clack in the quiet room. She looked at the floor, her shoulders hunching in that familiar, defensive posture she always assumed when the Miller family gathered. Calvin pushed past Monica, his wet boots leaving dark, glossy smears on the hardwood hallway. He looked wild, his tie completely gone now, the collar of his dress shirt unbuttoned and damp. Mitchell, Monica's husband, followed them in, closing the door behind him with a quiet, apologetic gentleness that felt entirely performative. Mitchell was a man who prided himself on his diplomacy, which usually meant he let his wife do the screaming while he managed the aftermath. "Mom," Calvin said, his voice loud and trembling as he stopped at the edge of the kitchen tile. "We need to talk, right now." "I am listening, Calvin," I said. I was standing by the stove, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter. I hadn't moved to greet them. I hadn't offered to take their damp coats. Monica walked into the kitchen, her eyes darting to the suitcases, visible through the open doorway of the den, and then back to me. She took a deep, trembling breath, her face smoothing into a mask of professional, reasonable concern. This was the voice she used when she was negotiating with difficult artists at the gallery. "Mom," Monica said, her tone soft, almost maternal. "We're all very stressed today. This morning it was a disaster. But we're here now because we love you and we're worried about you. Selling the house? Canceling Calvin's payments? These aren't like you. We think, Mitchell and I think, you're experiencing some kind of delayed grief reaction. Dad's been gone for 3 years, and you've been so quiet, so isolated in this big house." "Monica," I said quietly. She stopped mid-sentence, her lips remaining slightly parted. "Do not use your gallery voice in my kitchen," I said. "And do not pretend this is a medical intervention. You are here because your convenience has been threatened." Monica's face flushed a deep, angry red. "That is incredibly unfair. We are your children, Mom. We have spent the last 3 years checking in on you, making sure you're okay. You have spent the last 3 years dropping your children off at 6 in the morning," I said, my voice level, cold, and steady. "You have spent the last 3 years using this house as a free daycare, a free storage unit, and a personal bank. In those 3 years, Monica, how many times did you call me just to ask how I was sleeping?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at Mitchell as if asking him to hand her a script, but Mitchell was looking at his shoes. "How could you do this to Dad's memory?" Calvin broke in, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, childish fury. He took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "He worked his entire life for this house. He built the deck out back with his own hands. He wanted us to have this place. He wanted Toby and Maeve to grow up playing in the yard. You're throwing 40 years of our family history in the trash because you're having some kind of tantrum." The people who do the least to build a legacy are often the ones who scream the loudest about preserving it. I looked at Calvin. I thought of Curtis's final 6 months, when the cancer had spread to his bones and he could no longer climb the stairs. I had set up a hospital bed in the den. I had spent 24 hours a day changing his sheets, managing his morphine drips, and lifting his thin, fragile body when he was too weak to move. In those 6 months, Calvin had visited twice. Once was to ask Curtis if he could borrow $10,000 to settle a lease dispute. The second time was at the funeral. "Your father's memory is not in these bricks, Calvin," I said. "And if you cared about his hard work, you wouldn't have spent the last 3 years asking me to drain his retirement trust to fund your lifestyle." I reached over to the counter and picked up the manila folder I had brought down from Curtis's desk. I placed it flat on the kitchen island, right in front of Monica. "What is that?" Monica asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the faded cardstock. "These are the financial records of the last 3 years," I said. "Every dollar I have transferred to you, Monica, for your gallery investments and your household emergencies. Every mortgage payment I have cleared for you, Calvin. It's all there. The total, if you don't care to do the math, is $88,000. Calvin looked at the folder as if it were a dangerous animal. He didn't reach for it. "We were going to pay you back, Mom," he muttered, his eyes darting away. "You know things have been tight with the divorce." "I don't expect you to pay me back, Calvin," I said, "because you can't. But I am stopping the bleed. The house is being sold to cover the remaining balance of the trust and to secure my own retirement. I have bought a cottage 3 hours north. I close on it next week." Monica's head snapped up. "A cottage? 3 hours away? You're leaving? Mom, you can't do that. What about the kids? What about our lives?" "Your lives are your own to manage," I said. Mitchell stepped forward then, his face tight, his fingers twitching against the seam of his trousers. He let out a long, dry cough. "Lorraine, if I can just say something. From a financial perspective, selling the house right now might not be the wisest move. Monica and I, well, we actually had a proposal we were going to bring to you next month. We were looking into a reverse mortgage option. We had a broker draft some preliminary terms that would allow us to access the equity of the house now to help fund some of Mitchell's firm's expansion while keeping the property in the family name. We were going to manage the paperwork for you to save you the stress." The kitchen went dead quiet. I looked at Mitchell. Then I looked at Monica. She didn't look back at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the manila folder on the island, her jaw tight, her fingers curling into the fabric of her knit sweater. They had already drafted the terms? They had already spoken to a broker. They were planning to borrow against the roof over my head to fund their own expansion, all while presenting it to me as a favor to save me the stress. They hadn't just carved up my life. They had already begun to dig the foundation out from under my feet while I was still standing in the kitchen. "You had a broker draft the terms?" I whispered. My voice was barely a breath, but it carried a weight that made Mitchell take a slow, involuntary step backward, his face turning a sudden, chalky white. "Mitchell," Monica said, her voice a sharp, warning hiss. She turned her head toward her husband, her eyes flashing with a sudden, vicious panic. "Shut up!" But the damage was already done. The words had left Mitchell's mouth, and they hung in the quiet kitchen like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. Calvin looked between Mitchell and Monica, his brow furrowing as the realization slowly penetrated his panic. He took a step closer to the island, his gaze shifting from his sister to the manila folder and then back again. "A reverse mortgage?" Calvin's voice was low, vibrating with a new kind of anger, not the loud, frantic rage he had directed at me, but a cold, territorial resentment. "You two were going to borrow against the house? For Mitchell's firm? Monica, you told me there was no equity left to tap. You told me Mom's accounts were too dry to help me with the back taxes." "Calvin, it wasn't like that," Monica said, her voice rising as she tried to regain control of the room. She reached out a hand, but Calvin slapped it away with a sharp, angry motion. "It was exactly like that," Calvin shouted, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. "You were going to lock down the house for your own husband's business while I'm sitting here trying to keep my head above water. You were going to let me drown so Mitchell could open another office downtown." "We were trying to protect the asset, Calvin," Monica fired back, her polite gallery facade completely disintegrating now, revealing the hard, competitive core beneath. "If we didn't do something, you would have sucked this house dry anyway. Every 6 months you have another emergency. You've been using Mom as a personal piggy bank since your divorce, and Mitchell and I are the ones who are going to have to deal with the tax burden when she's gone." The siblings stood face to face in my kitchen, their teeth bared, screaming over the bones of my life, while their mother stood 3 feet away, entirely forgotten. When a family relies on a silent martyr, they do not learn to love her. They only learn to coordinate their consumption of her. And when the supply is suddenly cut off, they do not look at the damage they have done to her. They turn on one another like wolves over a dwindling carcass. Denise sat at the island, her face pale, her eyes wide as she watched the spectacle. She looked at me, a silent, horrified question in her gaze. I didn't answer her with words. I simply reached over to the key rack beside the refrigerator and took my car keys. I picked up my purse from the counter, sliding the strap over my shoulder. The movement was small, but Mitchell saw it. His eyes darted to my hands and then to the keys. "Lorraine," Mitchell said, his voice trembling as he tried to step between the screaming siblings. "Lorraine, please, let's all just take a breath. We can work this out. There's no need to make any rash decisions today. If the listing isn't live yet, we can call Warren and put a hold on it." "The listing is live on Monday, Mitchell," I said. My voice was very quiet, but it had a density that cut through the sibling argument like an iron bar. Monica and Calvin stopped yelling. They turned their heads toward me, their faces flushed and sweaty, their breathing heavy. "And there is no equity left for you to borrow against," I said, looking Mitchell directly in the eye. "Because this morning, before I signed the real estate papers, I transferred the remaining balance of Curtis's investment trust into an irrevocable medical and educational trust for Toby. It is locked, Mitchell. It is managed by Warren Vance's office. You cannot touch it. Calvin cannot touch it. And even if you had a broker draft 1,000 agreements, you cannot borrow against it." Calvin looked as if he had been struck with a blunt instrument. You gave the money to Toby? To Denise?" "I gave it to your son's future, Calvin," I said, "where you should have put your own money instead of buying golf clubs and new cars." "Mom, you can't just leave us like this," Monica said. She took a step toward me, her hand reaching out, her fingers trembling. Her voice had lost its anger. It was small now, thin and desperate, the sound of a child who had suddenly realized the safety net had been cut. "We're your family. What are we supposed to do?" "You are 38, Monica," I said, looking at her with a quiet, devastating clarity. "And Calvin is 36. You are both middle-aged adults with your own homes, your own careers, and your own families. If you do not know how to manage your lives without using me as a shield, then it is time for you to learn." I walked past them. Calvin didn't move. He stood by the kitchen island, his head down, his shoulders slumped, looking like a little boy who had been left behind on a playground. Mitchell stayed where he was, his hands deep in his pockets, his face pale and empty. Only Monica followed me to the front door. "Mom," she called out as I stepped into the hallway. "Mom, wait! Where are you going? You can't just leave the house. Where are you going to sleep tonight?" "I have booked a room at the historic inn near the coast," I said, not turning back to look at her. "I will be staying there until my cottage closes next week." "You're leaving tonight?" Her voice cracked, a high, panicked sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the hallway. "But the house, the furniture, who's going to pack all this? Who's going to clean up?" It was the final, perfect distillation of her selfishness. Even now, with the family structure collapsing around her, with her mother leaving the home she had lived in for 40 years, Monica's primary concern was the physical labor. She wanted to know who was going to clean the kitchen, who was going to wrap the china, who was going to carry the heavy boxes down the stairs. I stopped at the threshold of the front door. I turned my head slowly, looking at her through the dim light of the entryway. "The real estate agent has hired a professional packing and moving service," I said. "They will be here on Wednesday. Anything that is left in the house after Tuesday will be donated or thrown away. If you want your father's tools, Calvin, or if you want the silver, Monica, I suggest you come get them before then." "Mom," she whispered. I opened the front door. The cool, damp air of the evening rushed in, clean and smelling of wet grass and the salt from the marshes 3 hours north. I stepped out onto the porch, closing the heavy wooden door behind me. The click of the latch was soft, but it sounded like a gavel falling in an empty courtroom. The drive north was a slow transition of light and landscape. As the suburban strip malls and identical housing developments gave way to 2-lane state roads, The blackness of the night deepened. The rain had settled into a fine, persistent mist that clung to the pine trees lining the highway. My headlights cut 2 long yellow channels through the dark, reflecting off the wet pavement like gold foil. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want the artificial cheerfulness of a late-night talk show or the rhythmic thrum of music. The only sound in the sedan was the low, steady hum of the tires against the asphalt and the quiet, dry rattle of the heater vents. I had spent 40 years in a house where silence was always an active struggle. There was always a television hum in the basement, the high-pitched beep of a microwave, the heavy stomp of children's feet on the stairs, or the dry, raspy cough of a sick husband. Even when the house was physically empty, the mental noise of what had to be done next, the grocery lists, the dry cleaning, the doctor's appointments, filled my head like static. Now, for the first time in my adult life, there was nothing to do next. The road began to curve, following the jagged outline of the coastline. The air coming through the heater vents changed, losing the flat, heavy scent of wet pine needles and taking on the sharp, metallic tang of salt and low tide. At 9:30 p.m., I saw the sign for the Anchorage Inn. It was a long, low structure built of cedar shingles that had been weathered to a soft, silvery gray by decades of ocean gales. It sat on a grassy bluff overlooking the salt marshes, its windows glowing with a warm amber light that looked incredibly inviting against the blackness of the coastal night. I parked the car in the gravel lot, the stones crunching softly under my tires. When I opened the car door, the wind hit me, not the damp, stagnant air of the suburbs, but a cold, clean, moving force that carried the wild, ancient smell of the sea. It filled my lungs, sharp and cold, making me shiver, but also making me feel strangely alive. I took my 2 leather suitcases from the trunk and walked up the wooden steps to the lobby. The door opened with a soft chime. Inside, the inn smelled of dry wood smoke, pine oil, and old wool. A fire was dying in a large stone fireplace in the corner, the red coals casting long, lazy shadows across the braided rug. An older woman with silver hair and a thick hand-knit cardigan stood behind the desk. She didn't ask for my story. She didn't look at my suitcases and wonder why a 68-year-old woman was checking into a coastal inn alone at 10 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday night. She simply smiled, a quiet, professional greeting that felt like a gift. "Good evening," she said. "You must be Lorraine. Warren Vance's office called ahead to confirm your reservation." "Yes," I said. "I'm Lorraine." It felt strange to say my name. For so long I had been Mom, Grandma, Curtis's wife, or the widow Miller. To hear my own name spoken by a stranger who had no expectations of me felt like reclaiming a piece of clothing I had left in a drawer decades ago. She handed me a heavy brass key attached to a block of polished driftwood. "You're in room 12, dear, top of the stairs, end of the hall. It has a view of the marsh. The heat is on, and there's tea in the room if you need it." "Thank you," I said. The room was small, clean, and sparse. It had a white iron bedstead, a single wooden rocking chair by the window, and a small writing desk. There were no photographs on the walls, no reminders of other people's lives, no clutter. It was a blank space, waiting. I set my suitcases on the luggage rack and walked over to the window. The salt marsh was a vast, dark expanse stretching out to the black horizon where the ocean met the sky. In the distance, the rhythmic white flash of a lighthouse swept across the water, once, twice, then gone, a silent sentinel in the dark. I pulled my phone from my purse. I needed to set the alarm for 8 o'clock. I had to meet the utility inspector at the new cottage in the morning. When the screen lit up, there were no new missed calls from Monica or Calvin. They had finally stopped calling. Perhaps they had realized that the phone was no longer a leash they could pull to bring me back to heel. But there was a single text message from Denise. It had been sent at 8:45 p.m., nearly 2 hours after I had shut the front door of my house. Lorraine, the message read, I wanted you to know that I took Toby and left, but you need to know what's happening at the house. After I left, Calvin and Monica started fighting about Curtis's tools and the silver. Then Mitchell got involved. They aren't waiting until Tuesday, Lorraine. They're in the garage right now, in the dark, with flashlights, loading everything into Monica's SUV. They're screaming at each other on the lawn. The neighbors are watching. It's only been 2 hours since you left. I stood by the window, the blue light of the phone screen reflecting on the dark glass of the window pane. I looked out at the marsh, at the steady, silent sweep of the lighthouse beam. In the past, a message like that would have sent a cold spike of panic through my chest. I would have run to my car, driven the 3 hours back in the dark, and stood on the wet lawn trying to separate my children, trying to protect Curtis's things, trying to shield the family name from the gossip of the neighbors. I would have sacrificed my own sleep, my own peace, and my own dignity to keep up the illusion of a respectable, loving family. But as I stood in room 12 of the Anchorage Inn, I felt only a profound, quiet stillness. They were in the dark, in the rain, fighting over rusty wrenches and silver forks, while the house Curtis had built stood silent and empty behind them. They were destroying themselves, and they were doing it because they had never learned how to exist without my silence to protect them from their own greed. I tapped the screen, deleting the message. I turned off the phone, placed it face down on the small writing desk, and walked over to the bed. The sheets were clean, white, and smelled of lavender and fresh wind. I climbed in, pulling the heavy wool blanket up to my chin, and closed my eyes to the sound of the ocean wind rattling the window panes. I woke at 6:30 to the sound of seagulls. The morning light filtering through the thin white curtains of room 12 was a pale, clean silver. The rain had cleared entirely, leaving a sky so sharp and blue it looked as if it had been scrubbed clean. I lay in the iron bed for a long moment, listening to the rhythmic, distant crash of the waves against the rocky bluff below the inn. My back didn't hurt. For 3 years, my first physical sensation upon waking had been a dull, familiar ache in my lower lumbar, the physical residue of a day spent lifting laundry baskets, scrubbing tubs, and carrying groceries up the porch steps. But today, the ache was gone. My limbs felt light, cold, and quiet. I dressed in a pair of heavy corduroy trousers and a thick woolen cream sweater, tying my hair back with a simple tortoiseshell clip. I had breakfast in the inn's dining room, a quiet affair of hot coffee, fresh sourdough toast, and a small dish of marmalade. The silver-haired innkeeper smiled at me as she refilled my mug, but she didn't speak. She understood the value of a quiet morning. At 8:30, I drove the short distance to my new cottage. It sat on a narrow gravel lane that dead-ended at the edge of the salt marsh. The cottage was small, no more than 900 square feet, with white clapboard siding, dark green shutters, and a small brick chimney that rose from the side of the sloping roof. It was bordered by a low fence of weathered cedar posts and a small sandy yard where wild beach plums grew. I unlocked the front door. The brass key turned with a smooth, solid click. The interior smelled of old pine, dried bayberry, and cold sea air. The rooms were empty, the wooden floors painted a soft, clean gray. There were no drapes on the windows, allowing the bright morning light to flood the small living room, highlighting the grain of the ceiling beams Curtis would have admired. A large house is often just a monument to the things we think we are supposed to want, while a small space forces us to confront who we actually are. In my 5-bedroom colonial, I had been a caretaker, a manager, a curator of other people's clutter. Here, in these 4 small rooms, there was nowhere to hide. There was only me. At 9 o'clock, a utility truck pulled into the gravel driveway. An older man in a faded blue canvas jacket and a baseball cap climbed out, carrying a metal clipboard. His name tag read Roy. He had the weathered, lined face of someone who had spent his life working in the salt air, his movements slow, deliberate, and unhurried. "Mornin'," he said, stepping onto the small porch. "You the new owner, Lorraine Miller?" "I am," I said. "Warren Vance's office said you'd be here," Roy said, tracing his finger down a line on his clipboard. "Just need to read the gas meter, check the water main in the crawl space, and make sure the pilot light on the heater is working. Won't take more than 20 minutes. "Go right ahead, Roy," I said, gesturing for him to enter. I followed him through the small kitchen. He was methodical, checking the pipes with a small flashlight, his heavy boots making a slow, rhythmic creak on the gray floorboards. He didn't make idle conversation, but as he knelt by the heater in the utility closet, he looked up over his shoulder. "You movin' up from down south?" he asked. 3 hours south, I said, near the city. "Quiet up here," Roy said, his voice a low grunt as he adjusted a valve. "Winters can be hard if you aren't used to the wind. It comes right off the bay, rattles the siding pretty good. But if you have a good stack of firewood and a warm coat, you'll do fine. People leave you be." "That's exactly what I'm looking for, Roy," I said. He nodded, a brief, respectful gesture of agreement, before standing up and dusting off his knees. "Well, everything's in order. Water's on, gas is clear, heater's burning clean. You're good to go." "Thank you," I said, taking the clipboard to sign the yellow slip. As Roy walked back to his truck, he stopped at the edge of the porch, looking down the gravel lane toward the main coastal road. He pushed his cap back on his head, his brow furrowing slightly. "You expecting company, Mrs. Miller?" he asked. "No," I said, my heart giving a tiny instinctive flutter before I forced it to settle. "Why do you ask?" "Saw a big black SUV sitting at the crossroads when I drove in," Roy said, pointing his pen toward the highway. "Looked like one of those fancy city cars, tinted windows. It was just sitting there by the old bait shop. Thought maybe they were looking for your lane. Not many houses down this way." A cold, heavy weight settled into my stomach. Monica. She had my new address. It would have been on the papers Warren Vance had prepared, or perhaps she had found the listing brochure I had kept in my purse. She had driven 3 hours in the dark or early morning, and now she was sitting at the edge of my road, waiting. "Thank you, Roy," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I'll keep an eye out." "Have a good day, ma'am," he said, climbing into his truck and backing slowly out of the drive. I stood on the porch, watching his truck disappear down the lane. The silence of the morning had suddenly taken on a tense, expectant quality, like the air before a heavy fog rolls in. I walked back into the cottage, my hand reaching into my pocket for my phone. I had turned it on to check the time, and now I looked at the screen. There was a voicemail notification. It wasn't from Monica, and it wasn't from Calvin. It was from Warren Vance. I tapped the screen, placing the phone to my ear. Warren's voice was tense, his usual calm legal register replaced by a sharp, hurried tone that made my fingers tighten around the metal casing. "Lorraine," the message said, "it's Warren. I need you to call me immediately. We have a problem with the listing. Calvin and Monica went to the house last night after you left, and, well, they didn't just take the tools, Lorraine. They've done something to the property. The listing broker called me at 8 this morning. You need to call me back before the police get involved." I dialed Warren Vance's office with a hand that remained perfectly steady, though the skin on my knuckles felt thin and cold. Beverly picked up on the first ring, her voice hushed, as if she were speaking in a library. "Lorraine? Hold on, I'm putting you straight through to Warren." There was a double click, and then Warren's voice came on the line. He was breathing heavily, the sound of papers rustling in the background. "Lorraine, thank God," he said, skipping any greeting. "The listing broker called me at 8 this morning. She went to the house to install the lockbox on the front door, and she couldn't get in. The locks have been changed. But that's not the worst of it." "What did they do, Warren?" I asked. I stood in the middle of my empty gray kitchen, my eyes fixed on a single knot in the pine flooring. "They've filed an emergency tenant protection injunction," Warren said, his voice tight with frustration. "Calvin had a lawyer, some low-rent strip mall attorney he knows, file paperwork claiming that Calvin has been a paying tenant in your basement for the last 4 years. They produced a lease agreement, Lorraine. It has Curtis's signature on it. It's a forgery, of course, but it's a sophisticated one. Because of the local tenant protection laws, we can't list the house for sale while there is an active tenant dispute. It freezes the entire listing process until we can get a court date to prove the lease is a fraud. That could take 6 months." I closed my eyes for a brief second. The audacity of it was breathtaking, yet entirely consistent. Calvin and Monica had realized that they couldn't stop me through emotional manipulation, so they had turned to the law, using a dead man's forged signature to lock me into the very cage I had just escaped. They wanted to force me to the negotiating table. They wanted to hold my retirement hostage until I agreed to fund Mitchell's expansion and pay off Calvin's back taxes. "There's more, isn't there?" I said, opening my eyes. "Yes," Warren said, his voice dropping into a darker, quieter register. "The neighbors called the police at midnight. They saw Calvin and Mitchell loading appliances into a rental truck. They took the stainless steel refrigerator, the stove, and the washer and dryer. They also took the copper pipes from the basement utility room, stripped them right out of the walls. Calvin claimed it was maintenance, and that as a tenant, he was removing his personal property. The police couldn't do anything because of the active tenancy claim. It's a civil matter now, Lorraine. They're gutting the house from the inside out to destroy the appraisal value. When people are desperate to maintain their lifestyle, they will treat family bonds not as a relationship, but as a legal loophole. They will tear down the very walls that sheltered them just to sell the copper inside for a fraction of its worth. "Can we fight it, Warren?" I asked. "Of course we can fight it," Warren said. "But it's going to cost money, and it's going to take time. We have to file a countersuit, get a forensic document expert to prove Curtis's signature was forged, and petition for an emergency eviction. In the meantime, Calvin is legally allowed to stay in that house. He's already moved his old furniture back into the living room, Lorraine. He's living there right now, in the dark, because the utility accounts are still in your name, and we can't turn them off without violating tenant laws." "I see," I said. Before Warren could reply, a low, metallic crunch sounded from the gravel lane outside. I looked through the kitchen window. The black SUV Roy had warned me about was pulling slowly into my driveway. The tires rolled over the wet stones, coming to a halt just a few feet from my front porch. The engine died, the high-pitched hum of the alternator fading into the quiet coastal air. "Warren," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "Monica is here." There was a sudden, sharp silence on the line. "At the cottage?" "Lorraine, do not open the door. Do not speak to her. Anything you say to her right now can be used in the tenancy dispute. I'll call the local sheriff." "No, Warren," I said, watching the car door open. "Do not call the sheriff. Let her come." "Lorraine!" "I will call you back, Warren," I said, and hung up the phone. I placed the phone on the kitchen counter. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing my cream sweater before walking to the front door. Through the glass pane of the door, I watched Monica step out of the vehicle. She was wearing a tailored gray trench coat, her hair styled, her makeup perfect. She looked like a woman who was on her way to a gallery opening, not a daughter who had spent the night helping her brother strip copper pipes from her mother's basement. She stood at the bottom of my porch steps, looking up at the small white cottage with an expression of mild, superior amusement. She didn't look like she was in a panic anymore. She had the calm, self-assured air of someone who had just won a difficult hand of cards. She walked up the steps, her heels making a sharp, hollow click, click, click on the wooden porch. She didn't knock. She reached for the doorknob, expecting it to be locked, but I turned the handle and pushed the door open before her fingers could touch the brass. We stood face to face, separated only by the wooden threshold. The salt wind from the marsh rustled the hem of her trench coat, bringing with it the cold, sharp scent of low tide. "Monica," I said. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, polite, and entirely empty of warmth. "Nice place. A little small, don't you think? It must be very drafty in the winter." She tried to step past me, to enter the warm, clean space of my living room, but I didn't move. I stood firmly in the center of the doorway, my hands folded loosely in front of me, blocking her path. She stopped, her brow furrowing slightly at the resistance. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" she asked, her voice dropping into a patronizing, sweet register. "I've driven 3 hours to see you, Mom. We're all very worried about this move. We just want to make sure you're safe." "You are not welcome in this house, Monica," I said. My voice was very quiet, but it had a density that made her smile falter. the corners of her mouth twitching. "Mom, let's not be childish," she said, her tone hardening, the polite veneer beginning to crack. "You know what happened last night. Calvin has rights. Mitchell's lawyer looked over the paperwork, and it's solid. You can't just sell our family home and leave us with nothing. We have a right to that equity, Mom. Dad wanted us to have it." I looked at her perfect makeup, her expensive trench coat, her cold, calculating eyes. "You forged your father's signature, Monica," I said. She didn't flinch. She didn't deny it. She simply leaned in slightly, her voice dropping into a hard, venomous whisper. "Prove it," she said. The wind from the salt marsh swept across the porch, carrying the cold, flat scent of wet silt and decaying eelgrass. It ruffled the edges of Monica's tailored gray coat, but she didn't shiver. She stood there, her chin tilted upward, her leather-gloved hands clasped over her designer purse. "Prove it," she had said. It was a word she had used since she was a child. Whenever she had taken Calvin's toys or broken a ceramic dish in the living room, she would look at me with those same cold, defensive eyes and say, "You didn't see me do it. Prove it." Back then, I had smoothed things over. I had cleaned up the broken pieces, purchased a replacement toy for Calvin, and whispered to Curtis that she was just going through a phase. I had believed that a mother's job was to absorb the friction of her children's developing character, to protect them from the harsh reality of their own dishonesty. Now, standing on the porch of my new cottage, I realized that by protecting her from those small consequences, I had simply trained her to commit larger, more devastating betrayals. "I don't have to prove it, Monica," I said, my voice as quiet and steady as the tide. "The court will do that. A forensic document examiner will look at that signature under a microscope. They will compare the ink, the pressure of the pen, and the hesitation in the strokes. They will see that your father was already on high-dose morphine on the date of that alleged lease, unable to even hold a glass of water, let alone sign a legal contract." Monica's smile faltered, a tiny, nervous twitch appearing at the corner of her left eye. "That takes months, Mom. You know how the courts are. In the meantime, Calvin is in the house. He's the legal tenant. You still have to pay the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance, and the municipal fees. How long can you live in this cheap little shack while your retirement fund is being eaten up by legal fees? Mitchell's lawyer says we can drag this out for a year. You'll be broke before we ever see a judge." She thought she was being strategic. She thought she was talking to the woman who used to worry about the family's credit score, the woman who would stay awake until midnight, balance-checking the checkbook to make sure we could afford the children's orthodontist bills. "Greed is a loud, impatient thing, Monica," I said, looking at her with a quiet, clinical pity. "But patience is a silent, heavy stone that eventually crushes whatever is beneath it. You think you are starving me out, but you forgot one very important detail." "What's that?" she snapped, her glove leather creaking as her fingers tightened around her purse. "Calvin is currently squatting in a house with no copper pipes," I said. "He stripped them himself last night. The water is off, the heat is off, he has no refrigerator, no stove, and no washer. He is sitting in a cold, dark basement, surrounded by his own mess, while the temperature outside is dropping into the 30s tonight." "He has a space heater," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "He has a space heater," she said. And while I cannot legally shut off the power to a tenant, the utility company can shut it off if the account holder has filed for a transfer of service to a new address. I transferred the electricity account to this cottage at 9 o'clock this morning, Monica. The power at the Colonial will be disconnected at noon today. Monica's face went pale. The calculated, superior air she had worn since she stepped out of her SUV began to evaporate, replaced by a sudden, sharp look of panic. You can't do that," she whispered. "That's illegal." "It is entirely legal to transfer my own service to my new residence," I said. "If Calvin is a tenant, he must establish his own utility accounts. But to do that, he will have to show the utility company a valid, verified lease. And the moment he presents that forged document to a public utility, he is committing a felony. Warren Vance has already notified the utility company's legal department to watch for it." She stared at me, her chest rising and falling beneath her gray trench coat. She had believed she had cornered an old, fragile woman who would fold at the first sign of conflict. She hadn't realized that the woman she was fighting had spent 40 years managing the logistics of a family. She knew the machinery of the world far better than her children ever would. "You're a monster," Monica hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You're going to let your own son freeze in the dark? You're going to destroy his life just to sell a house?" "Calvin destroyed his own life, Monica," I said. "I am simply stopping my attempts to rebuild it for him. If he is cold, he can go back to his townhome." "Oh, that's right. The mortgage payment failed today, didn't it? The bank will begin foreclosure proceedings by the end of the month." Monica took a step back, her heels clacking unevenly on the wet wooden planks of the porch. She looked at me as if I were a stranger, as if the quiet, accommodating mother she had known her entire life had been replaced by some ancient, unyielding force she couldn't comprehend. "We will fight you, Mom," she said, her voice dropping into a hard, desperate threat. "We will make sure you never see Toby again. We will tell him what you did. We will tell him you let his father starve. We will make Denise's life a living hell at the clinic." "Denise has already left," I said. "She and Toby are currently in a safe house program managed by the county's domestic shelter network, funded by a private grant Warren Vance set up this morning. Calvin doesn't know where they are. Mitchell doesn't know where they are, and you cannot touch them." Monica's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked entirely defeated, her grand strategic plan dismantled in less than 5 minutes by a woman who hadn't even raised her voice. Before she could speak, a sharp electronic chime cut through the quiet of the porch. It was Monica's phone. She reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped the device onto the wet wood. She looked at the screen. Calvin. She swiped the screen, pressing the phone to her ear. "Calvin, what is it? I'm with her now. She stopped. Even from where I stood, 3 feet away, I could hear the high-pitched, hysterical screaming coming through the phone's receiver. Calvin wasn't just angry. He was in a state of absolute, unbridled terror. "Monica!" Calvin screamed, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate panic. "The police are here! They aren't here for the tenancy thing, Monica. They have a warrant. Mitchell's office was raided this morning. The federal marshals are at my townhome, too. They say Mitchell's firm was a shell company, Monica. They say he's been laundering money through the gallery. They're seizing everything. Monica, what do I do? What do I do? The wind seemed to die down, leaving only the thin, high-pitched hum of the phone's receiver vibrating in Monica's trembling hand. She stood frozen on my wooden porch, her face draining of color until she looked like a plaster cast of herself. The phone was still squawking, Calvin's voice a thin, frantic scratch of panic, but she had stopped listening. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the empty wooden floorboards of my living room, as her mind frantically tried to reconstruct the world she thought she controlled. Monica? Calvin's voice came through again, louder this time. Monica, are you there? The marshals are asking where Mitchell is. They have a warrant for his arrest. They say he was using the gallery's acquisition accounts to move money from the overseas logistics firm. Monica, did you know about this? Did you know? Monica didn't answer him. Her hand dropped slowly to her side, the phone still active, Calvin's voice fading into a muted, repetitive chirp against her wool trousers. She looked up at me. The arrogant, polished daughter who had stepped out of the black SUV 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. In her place stood a terrified, desperate child, her eyes swimming with a sudden, dark panic. "Mom," she whispered. Her voice was thin, dry, and cracked. Mitchell said it was just a short-term bridging loan. He said the logistics firm was just helping him clear some customs fees. He said we needed the reverse mortgage to pay off the bank before the audit next month. The puzzle pieces fell into place with a quiet, sickening finality. Mitchell hadn't proposed the reverse mortgage to help fund his firm's expansion. He had proposed it because the federal inspectors were closing in. He had needed $700,000 of clean, untainted home equity to dump into the gallery's accounts to cover the massive hole left by his laundering scheme. He had tried to use his 68-year-old mother's home as a federal shield, willing to leave me with a reverse mortgage debt that would have stripped me of my home the moment I couldn't pay the interest. He was going to use me, Monica, I said, my voice cold and hollow. He was going to let me lose my home to cover his crimes. I didn't know, Mom, she sobbed, taking a step toward me, her leather gloves reaching out to grab the sleeve of my cream woolen sweater. I swear I didn't know the details. Mitchell said we were going to lose everything if we didn't get the cash. The gallery, our house, Maeve's school tuition. I was just trying to protect my family. I took a slow step backward, letting her hands fall into the empty air between us. I didn't let her touch me. Your family, I said, but not me. You have to help me, Mom, she begged, her face twisting in a desperate, ugly cry. Tears were running through her perfect makeup, leaving dark gray tracks down her cheeks. She fell to her knees on the damp wood of the porch, her fingers clutching at the hem of my trousers. The trust fund, the $50,000 you gave to Toby. You can get it back, right? Warren can cancel it. We can use that for a retainer for Mitchell's defense. We can use this cottage as collateral. Even in her complete collapse, she was still trying to consume. She was still looking at my resources, my home, my security, and wondering how she could drag them into the fire to keep herself warm. She couldn't conceive of a world where her mother's survival was more important than her own convenience. A family built on lies is like a house built on sand. It doesn't require a storm to collapse, only the weight of its own secrets. "No, Monica," I said, my voice steady, unyielding, and quiet. "The trust is irrevocable. It belongs to Toby now. And this cottage belongs to me. I will not spend a single dollar of my retirement to defend a man who tried to steal my roof." "He's your son-in-law!" she screamed, her voice rising into a hysterical, echoing pitch that startled a flock of gulls from the nearby marsh. "Maeve's father! How can you be so heartless? How can you just stand there and watch us destroy ourselves?" "I am not watching you destroy yourselves, Monica," I said, looking down at her with a quiet, devastating clarity. "I am simply refusing to let you destroy me with you. You chose Mitchell. You chose his lifestyle, his expensive cars, his private schools, and his illegal loans. Now you must choose how to face the consequences." I stepped back into my living room. I reached out and took the edge of the heavy wooden door. Monica looked up at me, her eyes wide with a final, desperate realization that the door was actually going to close. "Mom, please," she cried, reaching out her hand. "Don't do this. Don't leave me." "Goodbye, Monica," I said. I closed the door. The brass latch clicked into place with a clean, solid sound. Through the glass pane, I watched her lie on the wooden porch for a long moment, her forehead pressed against the wet cedar planks, her shoulders shaking with deep, silent sobs. Slowly, she dragged herself up. She walked down the steps, her head down, her gray trench coat stained with water and dirt from the porch. She climbed into her black SUV, started the engine, and backed slowly down the gravel lane, her tires kicking up wet gravel until she disappeared onto the main coastal road. The silence of the cottage returned, deep, clean, and heavy. I stood in the center of my empty living room, my hands folded in front of me, listening to the quiet. The sun had risen higher now, casting long golden bars of light across the gray painted floorboards. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my phone. I dialed Warren Vance's office. He answered on the first ring. "Lorraine, is everything okay? Did Monica leave?" "She left, Warren," I said, "and she told me about the raid. Mitchell's firm was seized." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Warren letting out a slow, tired breath. "It's worse than that, Lorraine," Warren said, his voice dropping into a tense, legal whisper. "I've been reviewing Mitchell's corporate filings for the last 2 hours. When he set up those shell accounts 3 years ago, he didn't just use his own name. He listed Curtis as a silent partner on the corporate registry. He forged Curtis's signature on the Articles of Incorporation, Lorraine. The federal marshals don't just think Mitchell was laundering money. They think Curtis was the one who set the system up before he died. Unless we can find the original notarized documents Curtis kept in his private papers, your name and Curtis's estate are going to be dragged into a federal asset forfeiture trial." "Curtis's private papers," I said, my voice dropping into a flat, quiet register. "Yes," Warren said, the tension in his voice palpable through the line. "Curtis was a draftsman, Lorraine. He didn't trust digital files, and he certainly didn't trust Mitchell. If he knew Mitchell was trying to use his name or his registry, he would have kept the original documents, the ones with the notarized dates showing his actual signatures, and perhaps a log of Mitchell's inquiries. If we can produce those, we can file for an immediate administrative carve-out. It will prove Curtis's estate is an innocent third party. But if we don't have those papers, the federal prosecutors will freeze the sale of the colonial. They will seize the investment accounts, and they could even tie up the funds you used to buy the cottage. I looked around the small, clean kitchen of my new home. The gray painted floorboards, the bright morning light, the quiet. Everything I had spent the last 24 hours building was suddenly resting on a knife's edge. We can run from our families, but the administrative ghosts of their choices will always find a way to draft us back into their wars. You cannot simply walk away from a structure that is collapsing. If you are connected to the foundation, the debris will find you, no matter how far you run. "Where are the papers, Warren?" I asked. "Curtis had a small, fireproof floor safe," Warren said. "He told me about it years ago, but he never gave me the combination. He said it was in his workshop, beneath the concrete floor under his main workbench. He said only you knew how to access it." I closed my eyes, and the image of Curtis's workshop came back to me with a sharp, dusty clarity. The smell of cedar shavings, 3-in-1 oil, and rusted iron. The heavy oak workbench Curtis had built himself, bolted to the concrete floor of the garage. I remembered the day he had poured that floor, back in 1984. He had left a small, rectangular recess in the back corner, covered by a heavy steel plate that he had painted gray to match the concrete. He had told me then, "If anything ever happens, Lorraine, the papers are under the gray plate. Don't let the kids know. They don't have the patience for things that are buried." "Calvin is still at the house, Warren," I said, opening my eyes, "and he's desperate." "He doesn't know about the safe," Warren said. "At least I don't think he does. But if the feds put a seal on that door, Lorraine, we won't be able to get inside without a federal warrant, and that could take weeks. By then, the prosecutors will have already filed the initial seizure motion. You need to get those papers today, before the sun goes down." "I am on my way," I said. I hung up the phone. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't change my clothes. I simply walked out the front door of my cottage, locked it, and climbed back into the driver's seat of my sedan. The drive south was entirely different from the drive north. The sky, which had been a brilliant, clean blue in the morning, gradually curdled into a thick, heavy gray as I neared the metropolitan area. The traffic on the interstate became denser, the hum of the tires against the asphalt louder, more aggressive. The air coming through the vents lost its clean, salty tang, replaced by the exhaust of thousands of commuter cars rushing toward their own small domestic crises. I felt a cold, hard knot of dread tightening in my stomach with every mile. I was being dragged back into the noise. I was being forced to return to the house I had spent 40 years maintaining, the house I thought I had finally shed like an old skin. It was nearly 5 o'clock when I turned onto my old suburban street. The neighborhood looked different now, smaller, more crowded, the houses sitting too close to the road. The autumn leaves, which had looked so beautiful in the rain yesterday, now lay in wet brown heaps along the curbs, rotting in the cold gutters. I pulled my sedan to the curb 3 houses down from my old driveway. My house, the Colonial, sat in the dim evening light like an abandoned fortress. The lawn, which Curtis had mowed every Saturday for 30 years, was littered with small broken branches from the previous night's storm. The windows were dark, empty, and dead. At noon today, as I had promised, the power had been disconnected. The house had no lights, no heat, no life. But Calvin's sedan was still parked in the driveway, sitting crookedly on the gravel. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, as if he had left it in a hurry, and a pile of discarded fast food wrappers lay on the wet stones beside the tire. I turned off my engine. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out Curtis's old metal flashlight, the heavy silver one he had kept for emergencies. Its metal casing was cold and scratched, but when I slid the switch, the yellow beam was strong and steady. I climbed out of my car, the cold air hitting my face like a damp towel. I walked down the sidewalk, my steps slow and quiet. I didn't use the front door. I walked around the side of the house, past the overgrown hydrangea bushes, toward the side door of the garage that led directly into Curtis's workshop. The padlock Curtis had kept on the garage door was gone. In its place was a cheap brass chain that had been looped through the latch and locked with a small padlock I didn't recognize. But the chain was loose. Someone had left the latch slightly unaligned. I reached out, my fingers cold against the metal, and pushed the heavy wooden door. It creaked open, the sound echoing in the dark, empty space of the garage. I stepped inside, turning on my flashlight. The beam swept across the concrete floor. The workshop was a disaster. Curtis's tool cabinets, which had been organized down to the smallest screw for 30 years, had been pulled away from the walls. Drawers were lying on the floor, their contents, nails, bolts, drill bits, scattered across the concrete like shrapnel. Calvin and Mitchell hadn't just taken the tools. They had torn the room apart in their frantic search for anything of value they could sell. And then, from the dark, narrow stairwell that led from the garage down into the basement of the house, a sound broke the silence. It was a slow, dragging sound, followed by a wet, heavy cough. "Calvin?" I whispered, directing my flashlight beam toward the dark opening of the stairs. There was no answer, only the sound of someone breathing, shallow and ragged, in the pitch-black cold of the basement below. The beam of my flashlight cut through the damp, heavy air of the stairwell, illuminating the wooden steps covered in a thin layer of sawdust and coal dust from the old furnace. I walked down slowly, each step a deliberate choice. At the bottom of the stairs, sitting on a turned-over plastic crate in the center of the pitch-black basement, was Calvin. He was shivering, his knees pulled tightly to his chest. He was still wearing his damp work trousers, but they were stained with grease and plaster dust. In the cold, dark silence of the house, he looked incredibly small. Beside him lay a crowbar and an empty copper pipe cutter. He had been trying to strip the remaining plumbing from the laundry nook, but he had run out of light, out of warmth, and out of energy. He squinted into the bright glare of my flashlight, blocking his eyes with a dirty, trembling hand. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, childlike vulnerability. "Is that you? Did Monica talk to you?" "The feds. They took Mitchell. They were at my place, Mom. They're going to take everything. I don't have anywhere to go." The lights went out. "The water. I can't even wash my hands." I didn't lower the flashlight. I kept the beam steady, reflecting off the tears drying on his dirty cheeks. "I know, Calvin," I said. "Can I come with you?" he begged, leaning forward, his eyes wide and hollow. "Just to the new place? Just until the lawyers sort this out? I can help you pack. I can drive the truck. Please, Mom, I'm your son." I looked at him, and for the first time in 36 years, I didn't see my baby boy. I didn't see the toddler who had scraped his knees, or the teenager who had needed help with his algebra. I saw a middle-aged man who had spent his entire life using my maternal instinct as a shield against his own incompetence. "No, Calvin," I said. I walked past him, my steps echoing on the cold concrete. I went to the back corner of the workshop, beneath the heavy oak workbench. The gray steel plate was covered in a layer of loose dirt and discarded screws. I knelt down, my joints popping in the quiet room. I swiped the debris away, revealing the flush metal handle of the floor safe. I turned the dial. 24, 12, 78, the date of our wedding. The lock released with a heavy mechanical clack. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside, wrapped in a thick piece of oiled canvas, was the leather-bound ledger Curtis had kept, along with the original notarized partnership agreements and the log of Mitchell's forged inquiries. I pulled the bundle out and tucked it firmly under my arm. "Mom, please," Calvin sobbed from the darkness behind me. "You can't just leave me here in the dark. What am I supposed to do?" I stood up, dusting the concrete grit from my knees. I walked back to the stairs, but before I began to climb, I stopped. I set Curtis's heavy metal flashlight down on the bottom step, directing the yellow beam across the floor toward his plastic crate. "I am leaving you the light, Calvin," I said, my voice quiet and empty of anger. "But the rest is up to you." I climbed the stairs, leaving his soft, desperate weeping behind me in the dark. 2 weeks later, the morning sun rose over the salt marsh, painting the quiet channels of water in shades of pink and gold. I sat in the wooden rocking chair on the porch of my white cottage, a warm mug of black tea resting in my hands. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled of salt and clean earth. Warren Vance had called yesterday afternoon. The forensic document examiners had verified Curtis's original papers within 48 hours of receiving them. The federal prosecutors had formally cleared Curtis's estate of any involvement in Mitchell's shell companies. The Colonial House was back on the market, and the investment trusts remained entirely secure. Mitchell had entered a guilty plea and was awaiting sentencing. Monica's gallery had been seized, her luxury SUV repossessed, and she was currently living in a rented 2-bedroom apartment, working hourly shifts at a local frame shop to pay for Maeve's public school supplies. Calvin had been evicted from his townhome. He was currently living in a small studio apartment near the transit line, his wages garnished to pay his back taxes and the child support he owed Denise. They had spent decades believing that my silence was a sign of weakness, that my endless endurance was a permanent resource they could mine forever. They hadn't understood that when you pull the foundation out from a house, the structure doesn't just shake, it collapses inward, crushing the very people who took its strength for granted. I took a slow sip of my tea, watching a solitary heron lift off from the tall grass of the marsh, its wings catching the clean morning light as it flew north toward the open sea. There was no noise, there were no lists. There was only the quiet, beautiful reality of a life that was finally, entirely my own. If you found yourself captivated by Lorraine's quiet strength and the silent, inevitable unfolding of a family's self-made destiny, we invite you to become a permanent part of our community. Here we believe that every choice carries a weight, and that the universe always finds a way to balance the ledger in the end. Subscribe to Crazy Karma Stories and turn on the notification bell. Join us as we continue to explore the deep, silent currents of human nature, betrayal, and the quiet power of those who choose to walk away. Thank you for listening tonight, and may your own path be filled with peace.